We need to speed up the rate I talk about these two shows or else I'm gonna die of old age before I can finish the series, so I'm gonna cover a bunch more stuff than usual in this video, including Raijuta, Sanosuke's betrayal, Kenshin's flashback about his encounter with the masked doctor, as well as 10 filler episodes from the original adaptation. Well, I say I'm gonna cover these filler episodes, but there's honestly not a whole lot to say about them other than they're surprisingly decent watches. More specifically, they range from inoffensive but slightly stupid arcs and storylines to really fun self-contained adventures that take advantage of the great dynamic between the main group to some actually really strong and gripping character-driven drama. Episode 18 is a clear standout, giving Yahiko, in my opinion, the best moment he's had in the entirety of the show so far. I know that sounds weird when you think of the word filler, but it's honestly a really touching episode that shows how much Yahiko cares about Kenshin, and I tear up just thinking about the way it ends. Other really good episodes include episode 14, which is a Megami-centered episode, as well as episode 22, a well-paced train hijacking adventure with some solid comedy in it. Aside from those three, there aren't any other episodes that are particularly notable in any way, good or bad, so the only thing I'll cover more in depth is the Shur filler arc, because get this, the new anime also has filler in it, and weirdly enough, it takes place during the same part of the story the Shur arc does in the original, in the middle of Sanosuke's betrayal and the start of the Kyoto arc. Also, both arcs include a central figure who covers their faces and is assumed to be a man who is later revealed to be a woman. Also, they're both pretty bad. Yeah, the Shur arc isn't the best, but I do think it has some legitimate things going for it. For instance, the second episode of the arc is actually stellar. The pacing was incredible, the way Shur and Kenshin became friends was believable, not to mention the first scene where they truly interacted with each other was really well directed. There was genuine suspense and a cool cliffhanger for the next episode to follow up on, and it also has my favorite joke in the entire show so far.
私のせいで謙信がきっとご飯とかも食べさせてもらってないのよ。
And Shura is just a likable character, and as far as good things go, that's about it. The main problem with this arc is just how messy it is. It sets up a multitude of things for the main characters to do, but doesn't end up following through on a lot of those things. For example, during this arc, Kyoto feels guilty because she was the damsel in distress in the first episode, and Kenshin had to sacrifice himself to save her. So she, as well as Yahiko and Sanosuke, set off to go and save Kenshin before anything bad can happen to him. However, they ultimately just wander around a bunch without actually accomplishing anything of note or consequence, only reuniting with Kenshin at the end when he has already saved himself. Kyoto does not get a chance to redeem herself of her earlier failure, which is terrible writing because that was clearly meant to be her character arc here, and even though I like Shura, her struggles with femininity felt very sloppily inserted into the narrative, and in the end she just kind of ignores everything to do with that anyways. It makes you wonder why that was even a part of her character in the first place. Now let's talk about the flashback that Kenshin has in the new version. I kind of like the idea of this arc as something that shows how Kenshin has changed since settling down with Kyoto, but it's done pretty poorly in execution. It ends up feeling forced because there really isn't much difference between how Kenshin acted in this flashback versus how he acts in the present. It's just told to us that he's mentally fatigued and that's why he can't taste his tea, but the audience can't really see that in how he interacts with others or even in how he carries himself. Then at the end, Megami spells out for the audience what Kenshin now being able to taste tea means, and the show acts as if it's earned. This arc was really bland and pointless, although if I had to praise anything about it, I'd say that its placement is pretty okay. Putting it right before the start of the Kyoto arc makes sense emotionally and can, in theory, add to the tragedy of Kenshin leaving. It just doesn't really end up doing that here. So that's it for the two filler arcs, which are overall both pretty bad. And I'm not going to talk about the standalone episode where Yahiko fights for Tsubame because the only differences between the old and new adaptations when it comes to that episode are a matter of visual presentation, and we all know where I stand when it comes to comparing these two shows on their direction and cinematography. Old is better than new. So now let's go over the Raijuta arc, and boy do we have a lot to talk about here. Let's start with the emotional core of this arc, which is Yutaro's character as well as his rivalry with Yahiko. And shocker, I like the old adaptation more when it comes to this. Now, to be fair to the new anime, this was probably the aspect of the arc that they handled the best because Yutaro and Yahiko actually have some pretty endearing interactions with each other in the new version. They're not exactly mind-blowing, but it's fun to watch them play off of each other even if certain scenes with them in it could have benefited from actually putting them on screen instead of just showing the boring reactions of the other characters. They still have a fun dynamic in the old version, but the new one is much more in your face about it and not in a bad way. Unfortunately for the new anime though, there is a reason I said I like the old one better when it comes to how they handled this character. The old anime restructures this arc in a really smart way, focusing on Yutaro from the beginning and telling his story in chronological order so the audience can understand what he's all about right from the get-go as opposed to the very end. A lot of the extraneous details of his backstory and motivations are cut out here as well. In the new version, Yutaro's father being a merchant who bows his head to people more powerful than him when he used to be a cool swordsman doesn't add a whole lot to the story. It just adds a couple of unnecessary steps to Yutaro's motivation to become stronger and takes up more time than it should to fully explain. So the old version cuts this detail, reducing Yutaro's father to a dead man who is just a powerful swordsman, which is why Yutaro wants to be strong, because his late father was. This gives us the same result as the new version, but in a much less convoluted and time-consuming way. Secondly, like with all of the anime so far, the old version is much better at showing and not telling us what we need to know, particularly the process of Yutaro becoming more and more invested in the art of swordsmanship and growing to love it over the course of his training. In a montage, we're shown how drawn he is to the Kamiya style, how much he dedicates himself to improving, and how satisfied he is with his current regimen. We see every step here, whereas in the new version, he starts getting tips from Kyoto in one scene, and then in the next, he's just immediately amazing with a bamboo sword. It's not satisfying from a narrative perspective, so when he says stuff like, training with you guys was fun, I don't believe that shit because we didn't see it. Every time Yutaro expresses some kind of joy or excitement or any kind of positive emotion for his progress as a swordsman, like in this scene, it's told to us so impersonally, or it's undercut by Yutaro being all emo and talking about how he just wants to get stronger and how that's the most important thing to him. From the way he talks and the way the show skips over his sword practice, I don't get the impression that he's training simply for the love of the sport or for the thrill of improving a new skill. I get the impression that these things are just side quests to him that he recognizes as fun, but ultimately not that significant. He's more enamored with the end result than the journey to get there, and that's not that great because it lessens the impact of the ending to this arc. When Yutaro's arm is permanently damaged in the old version, it's a massive shame, not because he was solely focused on becoming stronger, but because the process of improving his craft in and of itself became rewarding for him. All that's left that signifies this plot beat as a tragic thing for this character in the new version is the information that Yutaro had a lot of potential as a swordsman, so we should automatically feel bad for him because now he can't capitalize on that. The final scene of this arc in the new version just doesn't have the same weight to it that the originals did because Yutaro has way less reason to care about his loss here than he does in that version. Now, like I said before, Yahiko and Yutaro do have an endearing friendship even in this adaptation, so it still works as an emotional goodbye between these two characters, but I just feel like the beginning of the scene was undeservedly dramatic. I also don't like how the scene sets up Yahiko's big moment at the end. It builds up to it by having Kyoto and Sanosuke think about how nothing they say could really cheer Yutaro up, which is meant to contrast against the way Yahiko actually gets through to him at the end, but it's just another example of tell, don't show. Since neither Kyoto nor Sanosuke actually try to do anything for him in the scene, their contribution amounts to just telling the audience about how sad Yutaro is and how great it would be if someone could do something to help. The original anime fixes this by having Kyoto actually say something encouraging to the kid. She tries to assure him that his arm will get better and that he'll always be welcome at her dojo. This is met with complete silence and not even the slightest change in expression. Here, Kyoto doesn't have to have an inner monologue about how there's nothing she can do because the audience can see that and more importantly feel it, which makes the impact of Yahiko's actions much more greatly felt afterwards. I also love how in the original, the track playing in the background feels like multiple themes in one that captures both the melancholy and optimism of the scene perfectly. The way it amps up after Yahiko attacks Yutaro is downright inspiring, and I didn't really get the same feeling from the OST in the new anime. So when it comes to the things the new Rurouni Kenshin did adequately, the original anime just did those things better, but that's just the stuff the new anime handled pretty decently. Now we get to talk about the really bad stuff, which basically comes down to one thing: how terrible Raijuta is as a villain. The only thing he has to offer as a character is this basic ideology that real swords are better than wooden ones, and that wooden swords are making people weak. That's it. He has no interesting personality or backstory, and his presence throughout most of his scenes is really weak for a multitude of reasons. For example, his introduction already suffers from the same problems plaguing the rest of this adaptation: bad exposition and lazy ways of establishing character motivations, but this time it's to an even worse degree than what I'm used to from the show. Here, there's a pretty lengthy setup about how concerned this irrelevant dojo master is about the future of swordsmanship that's not only really boring on its own, but also so on the nose that it makes Raijuta's entrance comical. I actually laughed when one of the first things he said was basically just a TLDR for the dojo master's monologue. It was just so blatant and lazy that I couldn't take this guy seriously for a while. This wouldn't be that big of a deal if the scene had actually established Raijuta as a threat, but it doesn't really deliver on that front either. All he does in the part of this scene that's meant to show how intimidating he is overpower a bunch of fodder characters and an old guy the audience knows practically nothing about. You're not emotionally attached to this person, so there's no reason to care about his well-being, and you also have no concrete idea of his skill level because he hasn't done anything impressive prior to this fight, so this doesn't even work as a way to power skill Raijuta. If I hadn't already made it clear, I think this entire sequence is pretty bad at introducing the villain of this arc, but it isn't necessarily the end of the world since this isn't his only scene and he has 3 whole episodes to make an impact. Unfortunately for him, this arc is just really repetitive. Raijuta does the same thing every time he's on on screen. He walks into this dojo, challenges Kenshin to a fight, and eventually leaves, satisfied with Kenshin's performance. Okay, cool. What does he do in his next appearance? He invites Kenshin to meet with him, talks to him about his ideologies, and when Kenshin disagrees with him, he starts a fight again. They scuffle for a bit, Kenshin breaks Raijuta's blade, and then Raijuta just walks away, putting their fight on hold almost exactly the same way as last time. Okay, sure. Later on, Raijuta starts another fight with Kenshin. They clash for a bit, but oh no, Yutaro gets caught in the crossfire, so they have to put their fight on hold again, just for Kenshin to come back and whoop his ass like we already fucking knew was gonna happen anyway. Raijuta's only role in this arc is to get into the same fight with the main character repeatedly, and seeing him do the same shit almost every time he's on screen is boring as hell. The old anime fixes this issue by giving Raijuta an actual plan for him to drive forward, instead of aimlessly challenging every dojo he comes across, then forgetting about that entirely and getting tunnel vision for the main character. He spends time trying to make his own kingdom while fully intending to fend off the current government because he's basically leading a rebellion. What this does for the arc is give it a sense of forward momentum and escalation in stakes, which the new version desperately needed. Because of how dangerous Raijuta is, the government is forced to step in and try to deal with him, which will lead to a lot of bloodshed and collateral damage because everything is going down at Yutaro's mansion. Now let's go back a bit and take a look at Raijuta's introduction in this version, which not only takes much less time than it does in the new version, but is also much more effective at showing the audience his raw strength. He cracks the earth and chops down trees effortlessly with his powerful swings, feats that are much more impressive than just fracturing someone's shoulder and breaking a wooden floor. There's also the fact that Raijuta kills like 6 people here, which establishes how ruthless he is in comparison to the main character, and is something that he did not and actually mentally cannot bring himself to do in the new version. This brings me to my final problem with this villain. He's never killed anyone before. Before anybody misconstrues my words here, that's not a problem in and of itself. Like, I don't need a villain to have a body count in order for me to think they're a good villain. It's just that with a character like Raijuta specifically, this twist makes absolutely zero freaking sense, because his whole motivation kind of revolved around killing people. I mean, he thought the wooden sword made people weak because it lacked lethality, right? And that was why he thought the only sword style fit to survive was one that killed people, right? If you turn him into this guy who's never actually had it in him to kill anybody before, then why was he doing any of the things he was doing in this arc? If he was just a poser this whole time, then why was he so concerned about the future of swordsmanship to the point that he wanted to challenge every single dojo in existence to prove that real swords are better than wooden ones? Why would he continuously challenge someone as skilled as Kenshin, someone who beat him at every turn over and over again, if he wasn't completely sure of his abilities and philosophy? Why does he go to such extremes to defend his ideology if he doesn't actually believe in it? When you write a twist like this, you can't just write the twist, you need to think about how this shit recontextualizes the character at the center of it all. Even ignoring the fact that this is completely inconsistent with the only piece of information that the show gave us on this guy, there's the problem of how any tension present within this arc is just gone now. As boring a villain as Raijuta in the new version is, at least he had the threat of death behind him, as unlikely as any of the characters dying would be. But this just denies the possibility altogether, and I know what you're thinking, well, it happens at the end of the arc, so it doesn't ruin any of the tension before that point, and I agree with that on a first watch through, but what happens when you want to rewatch the show? Raijuta becomes even less threatening as a villain, that's what happens. The old adaptation realized this and got rid of the twist entirely. Raijuta kills people and can't see the merit in the sword style that doesn't. This is why he goes to the lengths he does in order to achieve his ideal kingdom. He's an authentic person in the old version, and he's much easier to take seriously because of that. I'm sure you could come up with some justification for why Raijuta acted the way he did while still keeping the twist in mind in the new version. Like, maybe he was delusional and always thought that he could kill somebody if push came to shove, but it turned out he couldn't. But here's the thing, you can always come up with your own justification for an inconsistency in a story, but that doesn't make it real, nor does it alleviate the flaws with how that inconsistency was written. That justification that I came up with is not supported by anything in the show itself, and no justification could be. We are given absolutely nothing to work with or infer from when it comes to Raijuta's psychology in this arc. There are no moments he can be seen reflecting visually about his current circumstances, and for a show that's so eager to exposition dump everything about a character in the most obvious way to the audience, there were also no inner monologues which gave us insight into what he was thinking. It's a poorly written and planned out twist that I'm pretty sure was only put in the story so the main characters would look totally badass when they called his bluff. It's a really corny moment, and Raijuta is a terrible villain through and through. So overall, not a fan of this arc in the new version. It had a couple of things going for it, but it wasn't able to take full advantage of those things like the old version was. And even the things it did sort of right were just better handled than the original anime. Sorry for talking about this arc for so long, it just really struck a chord with me out of everything I had to watch for this video. Sanosuke's Betrayal is up next, and I'll try to keep this one brief. I prefer the original adaptation of this arc because Sanosuke is handled much more interestingly there. The old version adds the sequence where he and Katsu, his old buddy from the Sekio army, actually work work together before the big heist they want to pull. This serves two purposes. The first is to make Katsu more likable and get the audience attached to the idea of him and Sanosuke working together because they're a really good team. And the second is to serve as a call to action for Sanosuke's character. He's understandably hesitant to side with his terrorist friend, especially since he's got a pretty good life right now and he doesn't really want to ruin that. But he's prodded into action once he learns about a group wreaking havoc around the town and using the Sekio name in order to do it. Now this isn't perfect, and it also feels a little contrived for the sake of the plot because it just doesn't make sense for a bunch of petty thieves to use the name of a defunct group in their crimes, especially since it was confirmed in episode 4 of the old anime that practically no one living in this era has even heard of the Sekio army before. So it's a little questionable, but I'm able to suspend my disbelief for it because from a character perspective, it makes a lot of sense. It's pretty damn believable that after seeing his past squandered like this, Sanosuke's old hangups and grudges would come back to the surface, and so his decision to join up with Katsu at the end of the episode makes a lot of sense and feels organic to the narrative. He's portrayed really differently in the new version despite the fact that a lot of the emotional shit he's going through is the same. Like I said before, this sequence is not in the new version, so there it comes off as if Sanosuke sided with Katsu just because they used to be friends and not because he had a genuine reason to. I guess that makes more sense for this version of the character though, considering he gives up really fucking easily once Kenshin shows up to stop him. Sanosuke seriously has no conviction in the new version. He makes the choice to give up the revenge he sought after for so long and finally has the chance to act on unbelievably quickly. If all it took for Sanosuke to drop this was Kenshin saying one thing to him, then what was even the point of the storyline? In the old version, Sanosuke pushes himself as hard as he can, and Kenshin stopping him is satisfying as a result because it's something the characters had to fucking work for and earn. Everything about this arc in the new anime is just so whatever. Like, I genuinely can't bring myself to care about the idea of Sanosuke leaving his friends behind in this version if his interactions with those friends are some of the most effective cures for insomnia known to mankind. This party that Sanosuke organizes is just okay. So this scene is supposed to be a final celebration between Sanosuke and his beloved / cherished friends before he commits to a life of terrorism. Now, I think it would be fair to say that the narrative intention of this scene is to showcase the deep bond that Sanosuke has forged with his close friends. You know, Kenshin, Kaoru, Yahiko, a bunch of random ass old people we've never seen or even heard about before. I don't know why, but the new anime crams as many people into the scene as possible. So there's Sanosuke's gambling buddies, and then there's Tai and Tsubame, even Katsu is there, and I don't necessarily have a problem with any of these characters being here. It's just that for some bizarre reason, they take priority over the main characters, aka the ones we're way more likely to care about. Sanosuke's friends take up screen time because they just have to have a scene where they forgive Megumi for being a drug dealer, which is already not the most interesting thing in the world, but ironically enough, this was handled better in the original anime during that Megumi-centered filler episode I mentioned before, so weird flex for the old anime, I guess. Tai and Tsubame take up screen time because they get some self-portraits from Katsu, which no one cares about, but at least it's short. And then Katsu takes up screen time in the scene since he's asked to draw Kenshin, but says, oh, I can't draw you because you're wearing a mask and stuff. And like, we get it. Kenshin's a man of mystery, but can we please have Sanosuke interact with the characters that have the best chance of eliciting some kind of emotional response from the audience? Oh, and you know what's the real kicker here? None of this shit is even in the manga. The new anime added this stuff for no reason. You don't even have the excuse of this is just more faithful to the manga anymore because it's literally not. To anybody using that defense, even for this scene, this is ass and you have to accept that. He spends more time talking to literal nobodies, and the scene caps off with this moment that's supposed to be emotional with Sanosuke being all like, sorry guys, I'm not asking you to understand, but this is goodbye for me and stuff, in that really dramatic tone, which probably would have been more effective if he had actually talked to them, like at all, during what was supposed to be their final gathering. You know, anything that shows you what he'd be missing out on by leaving, but I guess that would just be too goofy and over the top and not serious and stuff, because any joke or likable character dynamic is automatically immature or bad. The original version of the scene does the obvious thing and cuts out everyone aside from the main characters. Only Kenshin, Kaoru, her family, Yahiko, Sanosuke, and Megumi are present in this version, and wow, eliminating all the pointless NPC characters forces interaction among the ones that are actually relevant. Who could have seen that coming? Even if you disagree with the idea that these interactions are more fun than the ones that take place in the new version, which is kind of impossible to argue because this scene is absolute comedy gold, at least they happened, and this version of the scene ends up meaningfully contributing to the drama of the arc. This scene perfectly sums up Sanosuke's inner conflict, and I genuinely care about the characters and their friendships with one another in this version, so Sanosuke's decision to abandon those friendships is not only more impactful, but also a more difficult choice for him to make, and I like that. Kind of like another plot beat that happens soon, but for another character. But that's a video for another time. Hopefully, even if you disagreed with the video, you can still see where I'm coming from, or maybe I'm just full of shit. Regardless, I'll be going now.